Hello, everyone. Welcome to English Insights. Today's topic is the story of J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful men in American history. His life was not only about building a great banking empire, but also about saving the nation during moments of financial crisis. At a time when the United States was growing quickly, but struggling with economic chaos, Morgan used his wealth and influence to bring stability. This is a story of money, power, and influence, showing how one man could shape an entire nation's economy. It is also the story of why America decided it could no longer depend on one individual, and why the Federal Reserve was eventually created. Part 1. The young banker from a strong family. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 in a small town in Connecticut. He came from a family with a lot of money and a strong business background. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a very successful banker. The family moved to Europe when J.P. Morgan was a young man. He went to school in Switzerland and Germany, where he learned to speak French and German. During this time, he also studied mathematics and became very skilled with numbers. This education gave him a very good mind for business. He was a very smart and hard-working student. After school, J.P. Morgan went to work for his father's banking company in London. This was his first job. His father was a strict teacher and wanted his son to learn every part of the business. J.P. Morgan learned how to buy and sell things for his clients, and he learned how to make smart financial decisions. His time in Europe was very important because it gave him a global view of the world of money. He saw that the United States had a lot of potential, but it was not as organized as Europe. After moving to New York City, he began working for a company and quickly proved his talent in business. Instead of waiting for opportunities, he created them. Serious and confident, he knew what he wanted and was not afraid to take big risk. At the same time, he lived a very private life, avoiding newspapers and keeping personal matters away from the public. His personality was strong and sometimes difficult for others to handle. Morgan had a deep belief that order and stability were the most important things for a country's economy. He felt the lack of order was a great danger and believed men like him had a duty to bring stability to the chaos. This idea guided his entire career. His goal was not only to make money, but also to use his wealth and power to solve the country's problems. Part 2. Building an Empire. In 1871, J.P. Morgan made a very important move. He partnered with a famous banker named Anthony Drexel. Together, they started a new bank called Drexel, Morgan and Company. This new bank quickly became one of the most powerful banks in the country. Anthony Drexel was older and more experienced, but Morgan was full of energy and new ideas. The partnership was very successful. This was not just a regular bank. It didn't simply lend money, it tried something new. When funds were given to a company, the bank also took control and helped reorganize the business to make it more efficient and profitable. Morgan called this process Morganization. The business world in the late 1800s was a very dangerous place. There were many small businesses, and they were all fighting with each other. They would cut prices and try to drive each other out of business. Morgan saw this as a waste. He believed that if these small businesses worked together, they would be much stronger. So he began to buy up many small companies in the same industry and put them together to form one big company. This was called a monopoly or a trust. The idea was that one big company would be more stable and more powerful than many small ones. This was a very new and powerful idea at the time. He played a key role in creating some of the biggest and most famous companies in the United States. Among them were General Electric, which made lights, and other electrical products, and AT&T, which operated the nation's telephone lines. He was also involved in organizing many of the country's largest railroad companies. These companies were very powerful and made a lot of money. They were so big that they had no competition. Many people loved what Morgan was doing. They saw him as a great builder, a man who was making America bigger and stronger. But other people were worried. Many people believed he had too much power. There was concern that these giant companies were harming smaller businesses and the average person. But Morgan did not care. He was focused on his goal, to bring order to the economy. Morgan's power was not just from his money. It was also from his reputation. People trusted him. If Morgan said a company was good, then people believed him. If Morgan put his name on a deal, everyone knew it was a strong deal. His reputation was his most valuable asset. It was like a brand name that told people, this is strong and safe. This trust gave him more power than anyone else in the country. He had a lot of money, but his trust was even more powerful. Part 3. The Railroad King. One of J.P. Morgan's most famous jobs was in the railroad business. In the late 1800s, the railroads were a complete mess. There were many different railroad companies, and they were all fighting with each other. They built new lines that were not needed, and they would lower their prices to try to steal each other's customers. This caused a lot of problems. Many railroad companies were losing money, and some of them were going bankrupt. This was a very bad situation for the whole country. The railroads were the most important part of the economy. They carried all the goods and all the people. If the railroads were in trouble, the whole country was in trouble. He didn't just lend money to the railroads. He took control. Bringing the leaders of different companies together, he put them in one room and told them to stop fighting. Under his direction, they began working together, agreeing on prices and common rules. Smaller railroads were combined into larger, more stable systems, reorganized, and made profitable again. People called this process Morganization because he brought order to the chaos. He was like a teacher in a classroom full of noisy students. He made them sit down and work together. At one point, he controlled a huge part of the country's most important industry. His power was so great that he could decide who was allowed to use the railroads and what the prices would be. This was very good for the people who owned the railroads. The railroads were not losing money anymore. They were very profitable. But it was not so good for the people who used the railroads like farmers and small business owners. The prices were no longer low. They were now high and stable. Morgan's control of the railroads showed how much power he had over the economy. He was not a president or a king, but he had more power than many of the politicians in Washington, D.C. People called him the Railroad King because he had so much control over the country's railroads. He used his power to bring order, but he also used it to make himself and his friends very rich. Part 4. The Savior of America's Money. J.P. Morgan's most famous actions came in times of great trouble. In the late 1800s, the United States money system was not stable. It was based on gold. But in 1895, the government was running out of gold. People were worried, and they were taking their money out of the banks and asking for gold. If the government ran out of gold, the country's money system would collapse. The government needed to find gold, but it did not have enough. President Grover Cleveland was worried, and he did not know what to do. He asked J.P. Morgan for help. Morgan and his friends put a plan together. They collected millions of dollars in gold from Europe and gave it to the U.S. government. This saved the country from a financial disaster. Morgan did this not just for money. He did it because he believed that a stable country was good for business. He was a person who believed in order and stability. He showed that he had more power and more gold than the government itself. This was a very big deal. A few years later, in 1907, there was a new and even bigger financial panic. The panic started with a bad loan. People were afraid, and they ran to the banks to take their money out. Banks began to close all over the country. There was no central bank to help. There was no FED yet. The whole country's money system was in danger. The government was helpless. They had no idea what to do. The people of the country looked to one man for help, J.P. Morgan. He gathered the most important bankers in New York City inside his library and insisted they work together to save the country. Their task was clear: provide money to the banks that were in trouble. The bankers were afraid, but they all listened to Morgan. Morgan told them what to do, and he made sure they did it. Using both his own money and that of his friends, he worked to stop the panic. It was like a doctor giving a sick patient the medicine needed to survive and the effort continued for several days and nights. In the end, he saved the country from a total financial collapse. The panic stopped, and the banks were saved. Morgan's actions showed everyone that a central bank was needed. The country could not depend on one person, no matter how powerful, to save it every time. Part 5. The King of Industry and the Trust Buster. J.P. Morgan's power was not limited to banking. He was also a king of industry. He did not just help companies. He created them. His most famous creation was a company called U.S. Steel. In 1901, he bought a company from Andrew Carnegie, a man who made a lot of money in steel. Morgan combined this company with many other steel companies to create one giant company. U.S. Steel was the first company in the world to be worth more than $1 billion. It was a very powerful company that controlled almost the entire steel industry in this country. It was the best example of Morganization. But Morgan's power was also a problem. The government started to worry about these giant companies. A new movement started, led by a man named President Theodore Roosevelt. This movement was called trust busting. The idea was that the giant companies were too big and had too much power. They were hurting the economy by stopping competition. The government started to take legal action against these companies. Morgan's companies, including U.S. Steel, were investigated. Morgan was called to Washington, D.C. to answer questions in front of the government. This was called the Pujo Committee. In his view, nothing he had done was wrong. He truly believed he was helping the country and bringing order to the chaos. To the government, he argued that he did not hold a monopoly on power, but was simply a banker supporting the economy. But the government and the public saw things differently. People noticed how much power he held and how his companies were so large that no real competition remained. The Pujo Committee's investigation showed the public just how much power Morgan and his friends had over the country's money. This was a very important moment in American history. It showed that the government was going to start fighting against the giant companies. Morgan was a man of the 19th century, but the 20th century was different. The government was becoming more powerful, and the public was becoming more aware of the problems of big companies. Morgan's world was coming to an end. He was a man who used his personal power to solve problems. But the country was becoming too big for one man. It was becoming too big for a single powerful person to save. Part 6. Legacy and Lasting Impact. J.P. Morgan passed away in 1913. He died a very rich and very powerful man. His death was a big event. The U.S. stock market closed for a few hours out of respect. He left a great banking empire behind him, which is still one of the most famous banks in the world today, called J.P. Morgan Chase and Company. His legacy is a mix of good and bad. On the good side, He was a man who brought a lot of stability and order to a chaotic economy. His actions during the financial panics saved the country from disaster 2 times. He helped to build many of the great companies that made America an industrial giant. He was a great builder and a great leader. He was a man who was not afraid to take charge and make things happen. But there is also a bad side to his legacy. His power was enormous, yet he was not a democratically elected leader. He controlled much of the nation's economy, but the public had no voice in his decisions. His giant companies hurt competition and made it difficult for small businesses to succeed. He was a symbol of an age when a few powerful men had a lot of control over the lives of many people. He believed he was doing the right thing, but he also made a lot of money for himself and his friends. In the end, Morgan's most important legacy was a different kind of change. His actions during the Panic of 1907 showed everyone that the country needed a permanent solution to its money problems. The government realized they could not depend on one rich man to save them every time. There was a crisis. The chaos of 1907 was the final reason that pushed the U.S. government to create a central bank. Just a few months after Morgan's death, in 1913, the government passed a law to create the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created to do the job that J.P. Morgan had done by himself. It was created to be the lender of last resort and to bring order to the money system. J.P. Morgan was a powerful and complex man who lived in a very important time. His story is a great example of how one person can change a country. He helped to build the modern American economy, but he also showed that a new system was needed. A system was stronger and more stable than one person. His legacy lives on, both in the giant bank that has his name and in the central bank that was created because of his actions.